Hello and welcome to the First Right Podcast, your weekly dose of conservative news brought to you by Restoration of America. I'm your host, Hayden Ludwig, Research Director for Restoration News. Be sure to find our work at restoration-news.com. Today we're speaking with Mailman, a heroic woman fighting the woke attack on women's sports and Title IX legal protections for women. May is the director of the Independent Women's Law Center and a former advisor to President Trump, and we're thrilled to have her on the show. May, thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So talk a little bit about the Independent Women's Forum. What is it and what do you do there?
Yeah, so Independent Women's Forum is a nonprofit organization that focuses on issues for women, but we like to promote policies that actually help women and don't just sound good. So these are free market ideas and, basically giving women the tools that we need to succeed. These tend to be the things that help everybody succeed, deregulation and the like. But particularly what we've seen is that people no longer know what a woman is. And so what we are trying to do is basically just preserve the idea that women exist, that there is a being known as a woman that is biologically distinct from males. This doesn't sound like it would be complicated, but there is a leftist and I would say sort of new feminist critique to the idea of sex, that sex shouldn't determine anything about your life, and so therefore sex doesn't exist. And we're seeing that in women's sports, in women's locker rooms, in women's bathrooms, in women's rape shelters, in women's jails, and these are just manifestations of the issue, but I think erasing the idea of sex will fundamentally and radically alter our society to be depressing and chaotic. So we're trying to be at the front end of that to preserve our American way of life, basically.
I do think you're onto something. I mean, philosophically here, I think a lot of the impetus behind this idea that men can be women, transgenderism, or vice versa, right, really does come from this strain of radical, maybe socialist feminism that sees that really there's no fundamental differences between a man and a woman. So therefore, there are no men, there are no women, or a man can be a woman or a woman can be a man. That seems pretty clear, I think, to a lot of people that this idea has been stewing in the background for decades in sociology and women's studies departments. Is that the way you see it?
Yeah, I think you can see it in the push for even the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution and the push back against that, which is, yes, women and men are legally equal. We should be, and that's something to fight for. But that does not mean that women and men are interchangeable or the same. And we have to make sure that our laws and society reflects that do you really want women on the front lines of combat? No, for lots of reasons. One, it's unsafe, but also men should protect our communities, right? Men should protect our nation and their families. And so there is an idea of sex that is beyond an idea. It is rooted in biological reality. And I think, preserving women's legal equality is good and right. And it is something that this country stands for. Interchangeability is simply false and dangerous.
Yeah, that's right. You called up the Equal Rights Amendment, of course, a throwback to the 1970s. But another piece that came out of the 1970s, I know you're deeply involved with, was Title IX regulations. Those were created in 1972 by President Nixon in order to protect women in things like women's sports. But now under President Biden, or should we say really President Harris at this point, right, effectively, they've been overwritten to include men who say that they're women, transgender individuals who, of course, are not actually women at all. So really, they're not protecting anybody in particular, least of all women. Tell us about that change and what the forum is working on in relation to it.
Exactly. So Title IX is about women's legal equality. Before Title IX, women couldn't pick certain majors. You'd go to campus, you couldn't meet with professors. There were curfews. And if you wanted to have a sport, you certainly were not going to get a scholarship. That was reserved for men. But also, most sports weren't open to you. If you wanted to play field hockey, that's great, but otherwise, good luck. So, Title IX said that if you are a university and you take federal funds, then you cannot discriminate on the basis of sex. The basis of sex. And so what the Biden administration did is said what that means is you can't discriminate on the basis of gender identity, as if gender identity has anything to do with sex, which it does not. So what that actually means is that you have to treat people in accordance with their gender identity under the Biden administration's interpretation. So if a man says that he is a woman, then he must be treated as a woman and be given access to, for example, women's locker rooms. Otherwise, you're harming him on the basis of his gender identity. But what does that actually mean? That means that you're harming women. That means that women who have a biological, innate nature to want to shield their bodies from men, only men can impregnate women. I mean, these are biological desires that they cannot have comfort, that women must be exposed, that sexual assault survivors must change with men in order to accommodate the male and the male's desire to change with women. So this is completely backwards. It's remarkable, basically, how regressive this is. This is not women's legal equality. There is nothing to celebrate about this. So that is why Independent Women's Forum filed a lawsuit in Alabama. A lot of other organizations and states did as well. The result of that is that in 26 states, the Biden rule has been paused. It's not fully dead. It is paused in 26 states while litigation goes on. But if you live in one of the 24 blue states, they support this. And so in those states, yes, men must legally be allowed into women's locker rooms, have women's scholarships, be in women's sex ed classes, be treated as a woman.
And of course, that includes young girls as well, right? All the way down to kindergarten, first grade. Let me call back to a specific law that the vice presidential hopeful Tim Walz, governor of Minnesota, passed last year, which allows for women's tampons to be installed in boys' bathrooms here, right? I mean, that's the kind of insanity that this is creating. It's amazing to me that most people listening will remember the so-called war on women that Democrats accused Republicans of fighting 10, 15 years ago. But now we see that, in fact, the left is really launching a true war on women by trying to erase the identity of womanhood in its fullness, right?
Yeah, there is something very weird, if we're going to talk about weirdness, about calling women menstruators or chest feeders or birthing persons. That's not natural. That's not how we speak. Nothing that bizarre happens organically. This is something that there was a real effort to say, how else can we refer to women? And why else would you change your vocabulary that drastically if not to erase that there is such a thing as woman and that woman is biological, that there is a biological component to womanhood. And now woman still exists, but it has no meaning, right? It's anybody who identifies as a woman, and that's very circular, and it's either a very silly definition, like wearing a dress, or it has no definition. That is the new definition of women, either pure frivolity or, a complete lack of definition. So this is a very radical, a very concerted effort to erase women. That also means you're erasing men. And to erase women from society means, women are unprotected. They have to go to locker rooms and jails, etc., with men. That is bad. But erasing men from society, that erases, I think, something very fundamental as well, which is leadership potential of males, which is, the protective potential for males. Who's going to be our firefighters? Who are going to be our policemen? These types of things. There is no, I would hope strong individuals, like that, people who have those capabilities, those tend to be males. So by erasing women, you also erase men, you harm society, and that is all present in the Title IX rule, which is why I'm so glad that at least every Republican leaning state has challenged it.
Right. If there's no good, lawful, acceptable place for masculinity, then all masculinity becomes toxic masculinity, as the left likes to call it. It's the same thing with femininity. The left wants to erase these boundaries. I mean, really, it's biological, it's natural, but it's also just a war on the creator who distinguished male from female when he created all of us. It's a basic rebellion against these things that anybody with a pulse can understand. And people often ask when they listen to this kind of stuff, how can these leftists believe that? And of course, the answer is they don't really believe it. It's political correctness. They're towing an ideological line that you basically have to go to college to actually believe at all. And that's why I think we can have a Supreme Court justice who cannot define a woman, because she's not actually telling you what she thinks or knows. She's signaling, that she's sticking to a Democratic Party line in order to be acceptable to that party. I mean, do I have it right there? Am I overstating it?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And so people have to blind themselves to the immediate and long-term consequences,
Hmm.
which is pretty shocking. So we actually, Independent Women's Forum just launched a new website today. It's called iwfeatures.com. And you can see the real stories of how gender ideology, so this idea that there is no such thing as man or woman, is actually harming women on the ground. So we have stories from women who are in prisons, who have been forced to be imprisoned with males. I'm almost not even going to talk about how horrific that is, but if you can
Right.
stomach it, there's a video for you. The detransitioners, young people who have been told because they don't like their bodies, they're confused, they don't like going through puberty, that they actually might be the opposite sex. Some of them are lesbians or gay, that you might be the opposite sex. And so they're chopping up their bodies and they can never get it back. So when they're adults and they want to have kids, they can't. I mean, these are real stories and they are in all 50 states. So you can actually go state by state and see what's happening in your state. It's horrifying. And so I personally represent women who were forced to initiate a male into their sorority. Like, truly, no
Wow.
space is sacred. And so if you're on the left and you refuse to define woman, you are, yes, shielding yourself from some of the long-term, maybe what sound theoretical things that I'm saying about this is the end of society. But you're also blinding yourself to what's happening right in front of you, of men and women carving up their bodies, of males infiltrating sororities, of males infiltrating the playing field, the locker room, bathrooms, and so on.
Well, what is the name of that website again for people?
It, it's iwfeatures.com. So IW standing for independent women, iwfeatures.com.
And, not only are these permanent health effects, you're glorifying mental illness. I mean, the people who really do suffer from gender dysphoria, as tiny a number as that actually is, far, far fewer than the number of people who call themselves transgender. Those people ought to be helped. We don't take somebody who's suffering from a real mental illness and glorify that as if that's the way we all should be living. And the kind of mutilation, the kind of hormone therapy that they're making small children and young people endure, this is going to turn them into hospital patients for the rest of their lives. If they even live a long life to begin with, it's going to be one of misery and chronic pain and a lot of money spent in the healthcare system. And, the most cynical people might suggest that this is the way that the radical left wants people to live, to be government dependents for the rest of their lives. What do you think about that?
Yeah, there is I think the question of kindness and inclusivity, because I think as human beings, it is our nature to want to be moral and to be kind and do good. And we've been told, I think, and you can especially hear this when you talk to young people, college and younger than that, that the good thing, the right thing to do is to use the pronouns, is to provide the carve up surgery, also known as gender affirming care, is to let the male into the sorority. Like this, these people are sick, and what should we do? We should comfort them. Okay.
Hmm.
But it's not comforting to engage in a war that you cannot win. You cannot win a war against your body. You can't. There's no such thing as changing your sex. And so it is difficult. It's difficult to say no. It's okay to be a boy. It's okay.
Yes.
There's not a mistake here. But this is the difficult thing I think about being a conservative, is that oftentimes what is best for the human is the difficult conversation. I think about welfare, right? It is immediately nice to say, here's some money, here's some food, here's some shelter. That is the immediate kind, and it feels good to the soul to do that. But long term, no one is going to get ahead, as we all know, unless you've got two-parent families, you graduate from high school, right?
That's right.
Like there's an actual formula for that. And so to the extent your welfare is getting in the way of that formula for success, you're actually harming people. But this is the challenge that conservatives have faced for a very long time, is that the good, the moral, the right thing is actually a much more difficult conversation than what feels like the immediate comforting thing. And that's, although people always say this gender ideology stuff is so crazy, it's not going to last, right? Oh, it is here, and it has real lasting power because of that difficulty. I think that the human desire to just want to comfort rather than correct.
Yet any halfway decent parent knows you never indulge your child's worst impulses, right? You actually have to guide them, and that requires telling them no and stopping them from doing the things that they want to do. And making your kid cry doesn't feel good, but ultimately, you're right. That is exactly how you produce decent human beings and good citizens. And right now, what the left is asking us to do is to indulge the madness that they largely created, and it's creating these lifelong cripples. I do think it will burn itself out, but it's going to leave tens of millions of casualties behind, and people who are probably going to be embittered for a very long time by the lies that they have endured. I wanted to actually talk about one of the women that you have, one of the young women that you've spoken with and worked with, Peyton McNabb, who was one of the women who was injured last year in playing volleyball against a transgender man, so a man pretending to be a woman. And as I understand it, she's still suffering physical health effects right now. Talk about Peyton. I understand she works with Independent Women's Forum.
Yeah. So Peyton is an ambassador for Independent Women's Forum. She's a current college sophomore. She did a bus tour with me and other women at Independent Women's Forum talking about the problems with Biden's Title IX rules. So Peyton, when she was a senior in high school, was forced to play volleyball against a biological male. Now, this biological male was also a or a high school senior. This is an 18-year-old guy. Just, if anybody watched the Olympics, the men play volleyball in the Olympics. This is a high contact sport.
Yes.
So poor Peyton got spiked in the head from the male and was immediately concussed, down on the ground in the fencing position, and to this day, partial facial paralysis, lasting effects from the concussion, a variety of other health effects that she's going to have to pay for and deal with potentially for the rest of her life. I mean, they're causing even learning, cognitive disabilities, making college very difficult for her. So, and not only that, but she gets bullied, right? Like, because she is somebody who then went and spoke out and said, I am lifelong injured because I was forced to play volleyball against a male. This is North Carolina policy at the time. Thankfully, she helped change it. But North Carolina policy said that men who identify as women can play in women's sports. She went and spoke out against that policy, and now at her school will face really horrific messages, things like that. So the problem facing women is, yes, physical injury, life-altering physical injury. And if you dare to say something about yourself getting abused, then you are labeled the aggressor. I mean, this kind of goes to this oppressor-oppressed matrix that has to do with tearing down all of society. But because trans-identifying individuals have been identified as the oppressed, you as a woman cannot even say anything even when you face life altering physical harm.
Yeah, let's talk about that North Carolina law that you said that she helped change, because I think it tells people exactly where the two parties are right now. Of course, we are in an election year approaching November, so that was a Republican bill that was passed with support from Riley Gaines and Peyton McNabb. Right, I believe it was last year. Correct me if I'm wrong there. And then the Democratic governor Roy Cooper vetoed that common sense bill that blocks biological males from competing in women's sports. Unfortunately, the Republicans in the legislature had enough votes to override that veto, which is why we could say it's law now in the state of North Carolina today, thank God. But this is a red state Democrat governor, supposedly a moderate, and you see him towing the leftist line in the same way that New York or Massachusetts or California Democrats would do so. These are the people who are running right now for president of the United States, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. So you see that from top to bottom, there are no moderates on the left on this issue, and they will attempt to do this in absolutely every state where they can, including federal legislation if they can. May, as we wrap up here, give us a little bit of light because this is a very dark situation we're talking about. What is coming around the corner here? Are conservatives starting to A, wake up, but B, win on this issue as we fight back?
Yes. So I think there is optimism because the right is no longer afraid. I was in the Trump administration, the White House, all 4 years, and it always shocks people to learn that an Obama era rule that permitted males in women's rape shelters, mandated males in women's rape shelters, was stood for all 4 years. Trump White House never took it down. And that would never happen now. I mean, that rule would be gone if Trump were to win, as soon as humanly possible. And I think that should give people, and even when you see the journey of somebody like Kristi Noem, or who originally opposed a sports bill and now is a huge champion for keeping males out of women's sports. So on the right, I think there has been a waking up and a bravery. We see the more stories we see, the more people hear from Riley Gaines. I think on the right, they're not afraid. You can call me a transphobe. You can call me whatever you like. These things do not bother me because I know the end game. There
Yes.
is pessimism, I think, on the left. We work with a lot of people who are on the left, Martina Navratilova, things like that. Women who owe their success and their self-confidence to sports. So we do work with a lot of women on the left, but you're right. Politicians on the left will not support the idea that there are two sexes, even one bit. But this is a 70-30 issue. Americans do care. Americans do believe that that sexes are real and that women should be protected. So,
It's a
at
winning
one
issue.
point, either the left comes over to agree with the right on this issue, or they start losing. Like, I really do think that ends up happening. But the only way it will happen is if people wake up, because I think people do not even really realize what the left has already done in their cities, in their states, to infuse gender ideology. It's more, we don't have time right now to get into all the laws and all the policies, but I guarantee you, if you live in a moderate to large city, that there are bad policies in your city in place regarding gender ideology.
Yeah, I mean, parents need to pay attention to what's going on. Even in private schools, you'd be shocked at the level of this transgender LGBT ideology creeping in. But, people, when they start to notice this stuff, they get extremely alarmed. And I think it can depress them a little bit to think, oh my God, what are we going to do about this? People need to understand there are tens of millions of other people who aren't all conservatives, by the way. There are liberals who believe this too, who are fighting back against this. So you're not alone in this whole fight. Independent Women's Forum is helping with this too. May, where can people follow and support your work?
Yeah, so Independent Women's Forum is at iwf.org. And then, like I said, we just launched a brand new website, iwfeatures.com. So check both of those out.
May Mailman, thank you for joining the show. We really appreciate your time and what you do.
Great. Thanks so much.
And let me thank you folks for tuning in and supporting conservative voices like May's working to expose the truth about the rot spreading through this once great country. Remember that it's only by working together and by praying together that we can restore the United States of America to greatness under Almighty and Sovereign God. I'm Hayden Ludwig. Join us next time as the battle rages on.
First Right, a new kind of news summary without the liberal slant. Every morning, in your inbox, always free. Subscribe by texting First Right to 30161. That's First Right, all caps, one word, to 30161.